one of our guests of honor for his inaugural keynote speech, Dr. Mehmood Khan. Sir, I think we're going to go with Dr. Mehmood Khan, sir, who is the CEO of the Hevolution Foundation in Saudi Arabia. Now, I'm going to give, I hope you'll allow me just a few minutes, sir, because I do want to introduce you. First of all, I just want to make it clear that we're hugely privileged to have Dr. Khan here with us. He really is a true visionary in the field of healthcare and health span. His distinguished career expands and includes many C-suite roles for companies, multinationals such as PepsiCo and, of course, Takeda Pharmaceuticals. But he's also had extensive on-the-ground experience serving as director at the Mayo Clinic in their diabetes, endocrine and nutritional trials unit. So it really is a privilege to have you here in Islamabad, sir. Dr. Mehmood Khan, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, and I'm glad I'm not doing the policy talk. So the easier part is the science, but happy to change sequence anytime. It's a pleasure, and I want to thank the organizers, Mr. Chairman, special friend, Usman, who played an important role in me making sure I was here on time and arrived. It's been a long time since I was in Islamabad. It's great to be back. My comments I'm going to divide into two, maybe three parts. I've had, as you just heard, 3 careers: academic, physician, and faculty, industry, and now running the 2nd largest healthcare funding agency as a philanthropy in the world, second only to the Wellcome Trust. And as we look at this, we look at not only where the pharma industry is going, but the pipeline of innovation for the entire healthcare industry. And pharmaceutical industry plays a very key role in that, and I'll touch on that. I want to congratulate the members of this organization and this audience on the progress that's been made since the foundation of this country. Let us remind ourselves that when Pakistan was founded, there was no pharmaceutical industry. So while we have great aspirations for what the future might look like, it's always good to recognize the progress we've made from a nascent country that had no inherent capabilities to today. 70% of the drugs supplied in this country are by domestic pharmaceutical manufacturers. That is a huge progress. So the question not is to be complacent on that success, but to look to the future and say, how do we continue to be successful? We can celebrate the fact that there's maybe 20–30% of the local drugs available are multinationals. I would almost challenge you and say maybe that's a little too low. Why is it that multinationals haven't remained active in the market? We have to ask ourselves that. Because if you want a vibrant market, you need a market that exchanges ideas, exchanges talent, talent moves between institutions, and that international know-how enriches the local know-how. When you have an absence of that capability because of the absence of those players, you lose that opportunity. So it does behoove us to say, not that there should only be multinationals, but what is that right balance for Pakistan? And what are the incentives to create that? Because it isn't just the fact that they commercialize drugs in this market, but they bring valuable insight, know-how, and talent is developed from the young talent that leaves academic institutions, and often their careers are started because of the rigor they learn within large multinationals that bring this very diverse experience. And there are many examples of that, and many of you started your careers that way. So the question really is, what about the next generation? How are they going to be replacing that capability that takes a village to develop a CEO? You do not develop a CEO in a small environment. A global CEO is developed by a very large village, I can assure you, having been a CEO now 3 times. And it is not one person doing. So we have to ask ourselves that question. I congratulate you for the success of exporting to 60 to 70 countries now, getting accreditation from international agencies. All these are pluses and wins. And yet, for a country of 250 million people, a domestic market, pharma, of 3 billion is way too small. One really has to ask ourselves, for 250 million people, why is the market only 3 billion? And what are the barriers? Because if we don't understand the barriers, we cannot bring about change. And some of them have been touched on, and I'll come back to those. But what is the goal of this organization? And I had the privilege of learning last night from many of our colleagues who are here today about the industry and its progress. The goal of this industry in this country, like any other country, is to serve the citizens, provide life-saving, valuable, innovative, reliable, predictable therapeutics and diagnostics in the market at an affordable and accessible price. Much of that you're doing. The question is, will you keep up with the future of this industry as it transforms? And let's take a look at what is happening around the world. Now, in order to do that, we often use a word, innovation. It is a way overused word, in my opinion, because what we really need to think about is, what is innovation? Innovation is the translation, and this is my perspective, of taking an invention and transforming it into an innovation. There is an important distinction between inventing and innovating. Inventions are things that happen predominantly in advanced academic research centers, national laboratories, large institutions that develop the novel new pathways, molecules, receptors, all of those things. And I'll use a commonly used example, the COVID vaccine. We all are familiar. Probably everybody in this room took it. Most people don't realize that it took 10 to 15 years of invention in US national laboratories and the US NIH to develop the platform that enabled the world to take that invention and make it into a vaccine in 1 year. That was the innovation. Without the invention, there was no innovation. Let us not forget that. And I can give you drug after drug after drug. It took somebody to discover the HMG-CoA reductase enzyme before there was a statin. The statin was a consequence of the learning of that enzyme's existence and its role. Without the enzyme, there was no drug. And so that partnership in society between the different sectors, which is the academic sector, the public sector, and the private sector, which includes not only manufacturing, but the finance sector, is a collaboration that enables this industry to continue the pipeline. And so therefore, we have to ask ourselves, what are the pieces we have, and what are the pieces missing? And if they're not existing, doesn't mean to say you sit back and say, well, we don't have the resources to build those. The question is, what can you beg, borrow, and steal? What can you actually partner with to enable you to leverage what already exists? And if you have the capabilities to do that leverage, you can succeed. And so the question then that raises for the industry is, do we have that capability? Because it starts with the ability to collaborate. Not just collaborate internationally, but collaborate within your own organizations and between yourselves. So one of the questions I was asking myself last night is, how much collaboration is going on between the 250 pharmaceutical companies that exist in Pakistan? Because that was a new learning for me. I was really surprised to learn how many there are. And then I thought about it, and it's actually not surprising. Anytime there's a vacuum when international companies left, Pakistan is full of great, smart entrepreneurs. And they looked at the opportunity, and they took that opportunity and said, we can fill that gap. Congratulations. The next phase is going to be, in that S-curve, is how do you now develop the scale to actually now reach the impact that you desire? And that will happen either through consolidation, which has happened around the world. Let's take a look at it. The United Kingdom, with a GDP significantly larger than this country, has 2 major pharmaceutical companies. Not 200, has 2. The United States has about 10 which dominate, and Europe has 3 to 4. Japan, 3 or 4. So the real question is, what is going to be the future of the industry in this country? Will it be 250? Will they consolidate, or will you collaborate in order to create the next key requirement, which is leverage? You cannot have leverage without collaboration. You cannot have leverage with your own government. You cannot have leverage with the market, retailers, distributors, nor can you have leverage on the international market, which you aspire to export to. Because in the absence of leverage, you do not have the next thing, which is scale. The challenge is, without scale, you cannot sit at the table and negotiate. And this is something that is being realized around the world, and I'll talk about the Middle East in a minute. If we really think about what COVID taught us for this industry, it wasn't the vaccine. It was the fact that suddenly leaders and policymakers woke up and realized in the entire Gulf, in the GCC, they ran out of paracetamol. The GCC ran out of paracetamol. There was not enough available because the entire world's supply was being used to treat fevers in their home countries. What do you think leaders are going to do when they see that? We ran out of IV fluids. In the United States, there was no antiseptics available. Why? Because the supply chains had been fragmented as a result of efficiency. Now that's an opportunity, because when you have such consolidation, it's gone too far. And so governments around the world have now woken up and said, we need, at a minimum, regional supply chains. We need regional security for not only key parts of society such as defense and education, but we need local supply of this industry. So that, not if, but when the next health crisis comes, we will have the ability to serve our own citizens. As a result, the entire GCC, for example, is looking at this. European Union is setting up its own supply chains. North America is onshoring its supply chains again. That is going to continue to happen. So the question is not, can the Pakistani industry continue to do business on a past model of supplying generics where you have big players like India and China that already have massive shares of the market, and you want to take a small part of that pie, which is going to change now because the rules are changing, or are you going to create a new role in this new changing world? And that's a question that you have to ask yourselves as leaders. And therefore, how are you going to do it? And I'll touch on that as I move on. I was asked to give a very broad mandate. I'm going to touch on several topics. Now, I have to be careful, because Faisal is going to do a fireside with me, and I want to be careful he doesn't ask me tough questions, so I have to be nice to him. Now, what will give you leverage other than scales? I mentioned leverage. I mentioned scale. The third is differentiation. If you have something that differentiates you at the marketplace, you have leverage. If you have a unique capability, unique technology, unique branding, reliability, confidence in your product on an international scale, not a local scale, then you have leverage. The challenge right now you have to ask yourselves is, what are the policy frameworks that level the playing field for this industry and give international markets confidence in your product and supply chain? For example, if you are making biosimilars, do you have a standard that is set for bioequivalence? Does it exist? And if you don't have bioequivalence within your own country, then how is another country going to rely on your product? It is not a level playing field. That is a policy framework that enables the industry to grow. So this is the partnership between policy, the public sector, and the private sector. It is not one or the other. It is not us and them. I had the chance and the privilege for 4 years to serve as chairman of the U.S. federal committee called the Committee on Advanced Technologies, overseeing the U.S. National Lab run by the U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce. Very few people realize it's a Pakistani who is the chairman of the U.S. Visiting Committee on Advanced Technologies, covering all industries, not just health. The fact that a civilian is overseeing a federal, U.S. federal national institution is testimony to the checks and balances between the private sector and the public sector. The U.S. is a great example. It is not the public sector versus the private sector. It is the private sector providing the oversight of the public sector, because it is the public sector serves that private sector, not the other way around. We look at citizens being served by the public sector, not citizens serving the public sector. And therefore, policy frameworks come together. This is what makes the U.S. innovation ecosystem so powerful. So if we're going to look at benchmarks, we have to ask ourselves for this industry, how did we shape that? How is that done? Now, let me ask you, what are the key enablers? I mentioned one, which is the policy framework. I gave 2 examples. There are numerous others, and you know them better than I know them for Pakistan. The second I'm compelled to touch on is human capital, talent. Pakistan produces some of the best talent in the world. Pakistani talent exists not only in the region, exists around the world. They now serve as mayors, heads of state, national leaders, industry leaders, CEOs, chairmen, you grow it. That is Pakistani talent. The challenge is that Pakistani talent is rarely retained by Pakistan to the capacity that is needed. It is not that talent is absent in Pakistan, but too many of its best talent of our next generation leave. And so it is not my generation that's important in this. It is not. It is time for my generation to not only hand over, but we're in the phase of retirement. My colleague said he's 47. Well, in March I turned 67, young man. And so it is all relative. My point is that it is that next generation we have to nurture. And in nurturing that, we need to nurture them. We educate them in Pakistan, but somehow we do not keep them in the proportions that we need, and this industry needs them. Not just physicians. It needs scientists, it needs discovery, development, regulatory, all those capabilities, and it needs business executives. Well-trained business executives who have broad experience, not just from one company, but from multiple companies, because the strength of those executives is that nurturing and interchange of ideas. In fact, institutions that are developing their talent only vertically end up being weakened. Institutions that cross-fertilize, even between competitors, actually strengthen. If you look at any ecosystem where that happens. Now, let me talk a little bit from the structure, the challenges, to the opportunities for Pakistan. Pakistan cannot compete on price. Doesn't have the scale that India and China do. So let's not just try and compete on price. And by the way, competing on price is in essence a diminishing returns. One lowers the price, the other competitor lowers the price, and eventually you get to the point of barely making enough money that anybody survives. This has already happened in the United States, the UK, European Union. Almost all generic manufacturers have disappeared out of North America, Western Europe, and the UK. Why? Because they couldn't compete on price. Now, politicians are actually asking, was that a good thing? Should they have been protected given supply chains? A recent article just published last week has actually challenged that from, I think it was Brookings, that just published this paper a week ago. Read it. The US government is saying, no, let's onshore the generics. Is that an opportunity? Is that an opportunity for Asian generics manufacturers now to set up shop in the US and create a local supply chain? I'll defer that to you. But pricing is not a strategy. It's a short-term market share win. Innovation gives you pricing. So then the question really comes, what are the unique opportunities that Pakistan offers that the world needs? Not just what Pakistan needs, but what the world needs, and there are several. Number one, what COVID taught us, and COVID was not the first challenge. If you remember, those of you who are old enough, and most of you are, before COVID, there was MERS, and before MERS, there was SARS, and before that, we've had malaria, now we have dengue, and by the way, dengue has appeared in Texas. Not from immigrants, but local transmission of dengue. Dengue has appeared in the Gulf as local dengue. One thing I can guarantee you, when wealthy countries face a new health threat, the resources from the health department move in the direction to quell that. That is why the COVID vaccine was globalized, because it was a first world threat. Even if it didn't start there, the investment came massively out of North America and the US, and Europe. Similarly, the opportunity to develop diagnostics and therapeutics devices that are relevant to the world emanating from this country are a huge and unique differentiating opportunity. The question really for the industry and the country is, what are you going to do to take advantage of it? Not how many are you going to do, because it just takes one. You create the first win, not 10, create the first win, and that gives a center of gravity that becomes a catalyst for an ecosystem to develop around that win. So the question really is, how are you going to collaborate between public and private sector to find that opportunity and then leverage it? The second opportunity is the fact of multi-resistant organisms. Multi-resistant organisms now kill more people than cancer. Multi-resistant organisms kill more people than cancer. And yet, the research development dollars for cancer hugely outshadow what happens to microbiology. Let me give you an example. The US NIH research budget, the largest research funding, health funding agency in the world, NIH, is $44 billion last year. Just research. That is not the NSF, which is even bigger. That is NIH. That is not the national labs. The research health enterprise is probably in excess of $100 billion US dollars annually, not including industry. 44 billion is NIH. Of that 44 billion, 50% is cancer. And yet, the imminent threat is not just cancer, but what's coming is multi-resistant organisms, killing cancer patients, HIV patients, and I'll talk about the elderly in a minute. In order to really understand and develop those therapeutics, the US and the developed world and Europe and UK are going to have to come to developing countries to identify the strains, identify the genetics, test the therapeutic options, get the diagnostics. They have to be done here in some part or another. Question is, are you ready? Have you enabled yourselves to be ready for that opportunity? Because the funding will be there. It is not a question whether funders like myself and my organization is committed to funding about $1 billion US dollars a year. In the last 12 months, I've signed $400 million of contracts alone, just with research academic laboratories. $400 million a year, just research. The funding is there. The question really is, which institutions and countries are fertile soil to receive that funding? It won't come just because you ask. It will come because you demonstrate the ability to leverage it, to utilize it, and convince funders like myself that we should invest in these institutions, starting with the academics, the intellectual horsepower, which will leverage that and then transform the industry. Now, let me finish and give you a little window into the future. I've talked about the country, I've talked about the current opportunities, but where's the world going to? And it is being enabled. What I'm about to share with you will sound sometimes scary. It is being enabled by two massive forces. One is technology, and within technology, two things. Number one, we now have the ability to understand life at a molecular level. No longer is the pharmaceutical industry an industry of chemistry. And I'm going to challenge you, provoke you, and ask yourselves, how much of your industry is based on chemistry? That is old world technology now. The vast majority of new drugs coming onto the market today are no longer chemistry-based. They were either discovered using biology, manufactured using biology. One of the first, remember, was insulin, which is no longer using animals or chemistry, it's using biology. And the new therapeutics directly interact with your human biology. So the question is, do you have the biologists And do you have the biological labs? And do you have the biological capabilities and the biological manufacturing capacity to utilize this new frontier? Or are we still living in chemistry? Chemistry is old world. The second breakthrough that's happening is the ability to take massive amounts of data that is generated by these biological systems and now understand it in ways that we never could because we have high-performance computing and mathematical algorithms using computational biology that did not exist. When I went to medical school, and even when after that went to graduate school, unfortunately in my generation, you chose in your career when you were 16 years old whether you did biology or mathematics. And you were either going to go to medical school and be a biologist or you're going to be a mathematician. At 16, you stopped learning mathematics because you're going to be, my putter doctor banega. Mathematics kya karni? Ya ye engineer banega. Isne biology kya karni? Unfortunately, in many countries today, while the world has moved on and there's no such thing as biology or mathematics, curriculum, unfortunately, even in this country today, still talk about biology versus mathematics. And yet, the modern biologists are microengineers, and some of the best engineers are studying the biology as the engineering of biology, because these disciplines have merged. And do we have the educational policies that enable a medical school to teach mathematics and an engineering school accreditation to teach biology? Unfortunately not. And that means the human talent that does not exist to write the research proposals and ideas for that future. Now let me leave you with where the world is now moving to. There are 1 billion people on the planet today that are over the age of 60. By the year 2050, there will be 2 billion people over the age of 60. 1 billion more. They will double the population of people over the age of 60. And the vast majority of drug utilization is in people above the age of 60. Because age-related diseases, diabetes, hypertension, cancer, cardiovascular disease, stroke, most of your customers are middle-aged and elderly. They're not young teenagers and 20-year-olds, unless they take a short-term antibiotic. They're people typically 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. It is for you young people, not you, but your parents' generation, that are the customers of your products. And that customer base is about to double. And most of that's going to happen in wealthy countries, which have the purchasing power and need to take care of those patients. Some countries, 70% of the deaths from COVID were people over the age of 60. The world stopped because of the elderly. 70% of the deaths were over the age of 60, and to protect their lives, society was shut down. That is the reality. Society will take care of that elderly population, not only for them, but also for the young population. And so the amount of investment that's going into the research on the biology of aging and how aging results in age-related diseases is now the center of gravity of biological research. Not what is commonly written about, which is how do we live longer. That is rubbish. That is media soundbite saying longevity field. There is no such thing. This is not the elixir of youth. What is really being tried to understand is what is it about time that results in biological processes that change your youthful biological functions to functions that decline in a way that gives you cancer because your immune system changes, gives you diabetes, gives you heart disease, gives you cardiovascular disease. And can therapeutics actually intervene in slowing that degradation down? In function, not time extension. That is the next major frontier, because the global demographic change that has happening across the world, Japan, China, South Korea, North Europe, United Kingdom, the US, all these countries are experiencing a massive change in their population, and that population votes to put resources behind the care that is needed for them. That is where this industry is now going. That is where massive amount of investment is happening. But the diagnostics, the therapeutics, all of them are based on biology, including the wonder drug that we now hear about, such as Ozempic and the GLP-1. These are biologics. They were developed using biological systems. And I'll leave you with a fact. Europe's most valuable company today, Europe's most valuable company today is not an aircraft manufacturer, not an automotive industry, it is not an oil company, but it is a biologics company based on biology on one platform. And the investment it took, by the way, to develop GLP-1 was 25 years, not 2 years. 25 years ago, when I was a young graduate student, researchers started working on GLP-1. It manifested in the market the last decade and really took off the last 5. And look how biology is changing. It is changing the food industry. The market value of food industry has declined because of the US GLP-1, because consumption of many of those foods has changed. The market cap of many protein-based companies has gone up because of that. The market cap of healthcare suppliers and actual healthcare providers has come down because of utilization of those resources. Markets have shifted because of biology. So I hope I've given you enough to think about. I hope I've provoked you to not only look at the challenges, but look at also the potential opportunities. Again, I congratulate you for the progress you've made. I'm excited about the future. I think your industry is right at this inflection point, and you have some choices ahead. And those choices include not only investment of foreign capital, but developing your own human capital, making the policy frameworks that you need to enable your industry to grow, partnering with government in the right way, collaborating between yourselves to give you leverage and scale, and ultimately competing not on price, but on differentiated product and service, not just ready for today, but investing to be ready for the future. Because for our industry, I can assure you, just looking at the investments being made across the world, and now in my role, both in Boston and in Riyadh, the investments are very, very significant. The real question is not if, but will you be ready to leverage that opportunity? Thank you very much.